Hi, welcome. I'm going to wait a minute or two for folks to trickle in and then we'll get started. So feel free to get yourself comfortable, grab a snack, grab a drink, get some pen and paper for your LSAT work, and we'll get started in just a minute. All right, let's get started. So my name is Allie Bell, and I'm an LSAT instructor for Manhattan Prep. I have been working with Manhattan Prep for about 10 years now, and I am also a GMAT instructor and an instructor manager and the manager of training programs at MPrep. And I'm excited to be here with y'all tonight. Free prep hours are always really fun because we get such a diverse crew of folks joining. And with that, I'd love to hear a little bit about you. I'm going to say hi in the chat, and you should see the chat kind of glow orange somewhere. And I'm going to ask you in the chat, if you don't mind, to tell us your name, where you're joining this webinar from, and what is your LSAT status. So we typically get, a mix of folks who are just starting out with their studies to folks who have already taken the test and are planning for a retake or somewhere in between. So let me know in the chat. Hi, Tuska. Welcome from New York. Brian, also from New York. Welcome. All right, we've got a January taker. We've got a lot of Northeasterners today representing. Turner from Boston, welcome. Adria from Virginia, welcome. I used to live in Virginia myself. Hi, Samantha, welcome from Canada. Hi, Demi, welcome. I'm actually not sure where Valley Stream is. Would love to hear. Hi, Nicole, welcome from DC. I used to teach LSAT there. Hi, Sarah, welcome. All right, April, so you're getting started with a good amount of time. That's great to hear, Sarah. Having about 5 months is a wonderful amount of time to prepare. New York, okay, thank you, Demi. Hi, Amelia. All right, another Californian. I am in Oakland, California at the moment. Cool, so we've got a few folks who are just getting started with their studies, it sounds like, planning for the April test. Hi, Kamika, welcome. We've got another New Yorker. Hi, Eli or Ellie. Sorry if I'm pronouncing anyone's names wrong. Welcome from North Carolina. That's where my parents live. Okay, so you're on the long-term track there. Hi, Utund. Welcome from the Bronx. We've got well-represented New York tonight. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, it's great to have you all here, and I think tonight's lesson will be helpful regardless of whether you are just starting out with your prep or you're a bit further along in your journey. Before we get started, I just want to mention a few other options for free resources if you are on the hunt for those. One is to try one of our live LSAT classes. We currently are offering exclusively online 5 classes. And you are allowed to attend one of those initial sessions for free. So the first session is 3 hours long, and it provides a solid introduction to logical reasoning and a particular type of logic game called relative ordering. So super informative, and you can make your decision after the first class whether you'd like to continue with the full course or just enjoy that sample. We also have, for those of you looking for more of an asynchronous at your own pace option, we have an on-demand course called LSAT Interact that follows the same curriculum as our live course, but it is a series of pre-recorded interactive videos. And so you can sample those. I think they're really cool because they're not just like stock videos where everyone gets the same content. They'll actually have moments in them where you'll stop and you'll do a drill or you'll answer a question, you'll input your answer, and then the instructor in the video will adapt their feedback based on the answer that you provide. So it's a really cool way to learn. Our website is listed down here at the bottom if you'd like to check out some of those free options. And I believe for the LSAT Interact, you can sample, a little bit of it and see if you like it. So here is the plan for today. We are going to be doing some logic games work. Logic games are now 1/3 of the LSAT with the new LSAT Flex format. And so many of my students have some room to grow in logic games. And I imagine that that may be true for a lot of folks here tonight. What we're going to be working on in logic games today are what I think of as the 4 foundational diagrams from which you can sort of tackle any logic game. And those are the tree, the number line, the board, and the logic chain. Now, if you've read an LSAT book or you've taken a course, you'll know that there are more than 4 types of logic games out there. And I'm certainly not here to disagree with that. But the diagrams that you can use for the remainder of those logic games all kind of stem from these 4 options. And I think that's really helpful because it can get really overwhelming looking at all the different kinds of logic games and thinking about how do I pick the right diagram for this type of logic game. So I think when we boil it down to these 4 major options, it's super helpful when you first read that setup and you say, okay, is this an ordering game or a grouping game? If it's ordering, I'm going to start with one of 2 options. If it's grouping, I'm going to start with one of 2 options. And then I might need to jazz those options up a little bit, depending on what types of twists there are in the game. But that's a great way to help you get started. So I hope that this session tonight, for those of you who are just starting out with the LSAT, gives you a good introduction into the mindset that you want to use as you're setting up a diagram for logic games. If you're just starting out, I would not expect you to feel like a master of all 4 of these diagrams by the time we're done with this session tonight. That takes a lot of practice. So for those of you who are new to the LSAT, what I encourage you to focus on as we work through these 4 diagrams is the big picture. Can you tell the difference between a game that's asking you to order or a game that's asking you to put things in groups? Do you understand why we use these different diagrams that we use and in what scenarios? For those of you who are a bit further along in your studies, you may have already encountered some of these diagrams. And so this will be a good opportunity for you to self-assess. When you're under the gun, which of these diagrams are you able to quickly recognize and execute? And do you have any room for improvement in the way that you execute these diagrams? So the way that we're going to be going about this is using some drills from the 5-pound book of LSAT Practice Drills, which is a pretty awesome book that I actually helped to contribute to when it was published a few years ago. And basically what it does is break down the different skills that are needed for success on logical reasoning, on reading comp, and on logic games. And those skills are then transformed into drills. So all of the little mini steps that you need in order to get a really strong score are turned into drills like the ones that we're going to experience together today. And this is something that I regularly assign to my course students and my tutoring students, and that they tend to find really helpful. And it was authored through a collaborative effort by our instructors. So the drill we're going to take a look at today is all about the topic I just mentioned, which is how to set up a diagram for a logic game. So the way that this is going to work is in just a moment, I'll show you an excerpt from the book. It has instructions in general for the drill. I left those in case you find them helpful. But the main thing I want you to focus on is the logic game that's presented. So let's take a look at this first one. Don't start writing yet. But you can see this is kind of how all the drills in the book are set up. They have instructions that kind of tell you how to go about doing this drill. So in this case, They suggest that you give yourself 2.5 minutes, or if you're feeling like you're really strong in logic games or you really want to practice that time pressure, you could try to do the setup in 2 minutes, and I'll give you the option. And so you're just going to take out your scratch paper and you're going to create a diagram for this scenario. One quick tip before you start making your diagram, I find it really helpful to read through the entire scenario, including the rules, before I start making my diagram. So I don't start writing just right up at the top. I read the whole thing, and then I start making my diagram after I've given myself some time to think about the best possible diagram. So I'm going to hop off camera in a moment. I'll give you about 2.5 minutes to try to create a diagram for this. And then I'll come back on and talk about which of those 4 types of games this is and what the best diagram would be. All right, ready, set. All right, that is 2.5 minutes. I'd love to hear one word in the chat about how that felt for you. So think of one word to describe that experience. Put it in the chat. Thank you. So I'm seeing a spectrum right now from overwhelming to manageable and simple, and even a identification of what the right type of diagram is. Stuck, yep, absolutely. And that makes a lot of sense. And so I think part of what I want to address here is how do we go from this feeling overwhelming to this feeling manageable? And my guess is that for some of you who, are feeling that this is going to be manageable, you may have encountered games like this before and learned some strategies for using them. So for those of you who are feeling stuck or overwhelmed, I want to share some strategies for how you would know what to do when you see a game like this. So I mentioned at the outset of this lesson that the first thing I ask myself when I read a game is this asking me to put things in order, or is this asking me to put things in groups? What do y'all think? Tell me in the chat, order or groups? Cool. Everybody seems super confident that this is an ordering game. So let's just check out some of the indications. We are told that these actors are, first of all, going to be put into time slots. So anytime we're dealing with chronology, I start to think, okay, maybe I'm going to need to put things into sequence. And then the other big indicator for order is typically that the LSAT will tell you in some way that this is happening one at a time. So here we get everybody is just going to audition in a single time slot, and there are no two auditions scheduled for the time slot. All right, so this is one at a time. And I'm starting to imagine in my head that once I'm all finished and I've sorted, everything out and been given all the information that I need, that my ideal would be, some kind of number line where I have 7 spaces for the 7 actors. And, I've got them all in a sequence. Now, the first thing to know about logic games is that you will never be able to get all of these elements completely in the right sequence just from the setup. You're going to have some degree of uncertainty based on the information that you've been given. And then as you work through the questions, the LSAT will test you and give you additional information that will allow you to make more inferences and put more things on the board. But your goal is not to put everyone where they're supposed to be. Instead, your goal is to organize the information that you've been given and make connections between that information, or what we call inferences. So let's check out the information that we've been given. First, we have the names of the 7 actors, and I typically represent those just as individual letters, so J, K, L, M, N, O, P. And then we have a bunch of rules. And so I'm going to start just kind of jotting down these rules. So the first one, K auditions sometime after Q. So the typical notation I would use for a rule like this is to just put Q, draw a line, and put a K behind it, kind of like they're standing in line. And then I have rule number 2, M is before both K and O. So I'm going to put M kind of standing in line before K and O. Rule number 3 is going to be similar to rule number 2, J before L, and J is after K. And then rule number 4, L is after P. And definitely call me out if you notice me making any mistakes. A huge part of logic games is constantly double checking your work against the rules. There's so much of the same language before and after in every rule that you might make a mistake. I definitely do from time to time. So you always want to be double checking. So here's the problem with this. I've got 4 rules, I've got a number line, but I can't actually put anything on that number line right now. All of these rules are giving me pretty loosey-goosey information about this is just one letter in relation to another. So this is why we have 2 main diagrams for games where we put things in order. And we know that one of them is the number line. And the number line would come into play on the questions in this game. I'll end up making a number line later, but it actually doesn't end up being the best diagram for this particular game because I don't know where anything goes on that number line. And so it just ends up being blank. So instead of the number line for this particular ordering game, I believe Eli mentioned it in the chat, so shout out to Eli. The diagram that I'm going to choose is called the tree. And the tree is one of the 2 major ordering diagrams. So remember, the other one is just a number line. And the situation where we want to use what we call the tree is exactly the one we're in right now. when all of the rules that we've been given are what we call relative rules. So this is before this is after this, but we don't have anything specific about where anyone goes in particular on the number line, or even about like how far apart they are. Are they one space apart? Are they two spaces apart? Are they 5 spaces apart? We don't know. So we call this a relative ordering game because all of the rules are just one letter in relation to one or more of the other letters. And this is the time where we would want to make a tree. So I'll show you briefly how we go about doing that. So to make a tree, we kind of take this notation that we've got over here to the left, but we organize it in a way that allows us to make connections between these rules. So I want to see, like, for example, K is showing up in 3 of these rules. So there's got to be a way for me to organize this so that K is kind of emphasized. So what I would do to make a tree is still start out with that first rule. So K is somewhere after Q. Then I'm going to go to a rule that also features K and make a connection directly on to this rule. So M comes before both K and O. Cool. So I can take my K here and just add a line coming down from it to show that M comes before it. And then M also comes before O. So I'm just going to add a line after M to show that O comes after it. Then I need to look for another rule that will link to my existing diagram. I see a K again in the third rule. J is before L and K. So I'm going to put over here, J, oops, see, there it is. I misread the rule. This was definitely always going to happen to me at some point when I read a logic game. That's why we have to be super careful. So J is after K. So I'm going to put J over here after K. And then J is before L. So I'll add the L after. And then the last rule connects on to this L. L is after P. So I'm going to add a P up here. So the cool thing about this diagram is that now I'm able to go a bit beyond the information that I was given in the original rules to make some connections, or what we call inferences. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. Looking at this diagram, you know, the original rule told me just Q is after, or K is after Q. But now I know, for example, that L is also going to be after Q because it goes Q before K, before J, before L. So I can start figuring out new relationships using the information that I've been given on this diagram. All right, I see my chat is blowing up, so let me check that out. Yes, thank you. Who made that catch for me? L is after P. Oh, I can't see your name. Marv, you're on it. Thank you so much. So I will correct the L. Oh, yeah, Marv, actually, that's what it shows here. So P is before L, and L is after P. Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks. Cool. Let's see what else is going on in the chat. Yeah, thank you. N is in the scenario, but not the rules. Yeah, so I did just sub in Q for N. I think that is just a typo. Good call out there. Yeah, no, thank you all for catching that. So the Q, for whatever reason, doesn't show up in the scenario, but it does show up in the rules. So I think that's just a typo. Okay, I see some content questions here. Amelia, is 2 to 2.5 minutes a good goal or guideline for all logic games, or does it vary significantly depending on the game? I would expand that to maybe 3 minutes, Amelia, for some of the more complex logic games. So I would say it does vary within like a 1 to 1.5 minute range, depending on the type of logic game. And one thing to do once you learn the types of logic games is to figure out which of those games should be faster for you. So this game, relative ordering, once you learn it and you've practiced it a lot and you've practiced your recognition, this should be a pretty quick setup unless there's some kind of twist with this particular game. So because I've done this for a long time, you know, I could just throw up this diagram in maybe a minute. or less. And then I'd have to, of course, double check my work for errors. But there are definitely some that are faster than that. All right, lots of great questions. So just to put this back in the big picture again, this was our first mini setup. This was an example of an ordering game where we couldn't really put anything on the number line. So we decided instead of a number line to use what we call the tree. So for this next game, I'm going to give you a little heads up that this will be an example of an ordering game where you do use the number line, the other major basic tool for ordering games. So I'll show you this game and I'll give you, again, 2.5 minutes to work with it. Here it is. All right, that's 2.5 minutes. So I mentioned before we started this game that this is an example of an ordering game in which we'd want to use a number line and not a tree. Can anybody tell why? Why is this a game where you'd want to use a number line and not a tree? Tell me in the chat. So Sarah, the days definitely tell us that we want ordering here. But we could have days in a relative ordering game with the tree. Yeah, good. I see a call out to rule 2. I is in a fixed position. That is exactly right. So I get 2 much more concrete rules. Good, Kamika, that's a great call out as well. One of those is rule number 2, that I speaks on Thursday. And then the other one is this first rule, which is a bit more specific than what we saw in the last game. Instead of this is just like anywhere after Lopez, this is immediately after. It's what we call a chunk, where we clearly know how many spaces are going to separate these two. Yeah, or a block is a great way to put it. Awesome. So let's take a look at what a diagram that uses a number line might look like. And I'm going to cover up this extra stuff over here for just a second. So when we first start out, we have the days of the week at the bottom, the elements up here. We have I speaking on Thursday. And then you can see down here, this rule notation uses that strategy I mentioned on the last game, which is making connections between rules. So rather than listing out rule 1 and rule 3 separately, the person who did this diagram recognized that those two could be combined. L is going to be stuck like with glue to H, and then G is going to come somewhere after L, which means it inevitably has to come after H as well, since those are stuck together. So there's a cool advanced move that you can do here that I'm going to show, especially for those of you who are a bit farther along in your LSAT study. For those of you who are just starting out, understanding this and how we got here is a great initial goal, and this is a sneak preview of what might come later in your studies. So this game gives us an opportunity to use a strategy called framing, and this is not a diagram, it's a technique that can be used across many different diagrams. And framing is when we can see that there are only a couple of ways that a certain game can play out, so we may as well just go ahead and play them out and see what happens. In this case, the tool that we use for framing is this LH chunk or block. Chunks can be really helpful because there's only so many places they can go on the diagram, right? Like I can't put L here in Wednesday because then H can't fit right next to it in the Thursday slot. So if I'm looking at my diagram, tell me in the chat, what are all of the places that L could go? Nice, Brian. So L could go on Monday, which would put H in Tuesday, or L could go on Tuesday, which would put H in Wednesday, and that's it. There's nowhere else for it to go. So even though it wasn't directly stated in the rules, if I use my noodle a little bit and make some inferences, I can figure out that there's a two-way split here for where these letters can go, and that allows me to make frames. So let's see what that looks like. So the first thing that I would do is make a frame with L and H in Monday and Tuesday. Notice that I leave my initial diagram here and it's blank as a reference point for any future frames that I do, or if I make a mistake on one of my frames, then I still have my original diagram to go back to. So once I put L and H here, then I ask myself who's left of the letters, and there are only two. J and G. So J and G will either go in Wednesday or Friday, and I just represent that with the slash. That's not the only option though. So I also want to check out what happens when L and H go in Tuesday and Wednesday. If L and H go in Tuesday and Wednesday, then we actually can complete the whole board because G has to come after H. So I have my LHI, G ends up on Friday, and then the only remaining letter J goes on Monday. Frames, when you can get them, are awesome as a tool for the questions because now as I go through the questions, I've kind of already done all of the work. And all I have to do as I'm answering the questions is just check back against these two frames to see what are some things that could happen or that must happen as I work through this game. So I think that let me restart that sentence. I always recommend that at the end of your initial setup, before you go into the questions, you ask yourself, can I make frames and should I make frames? So is there a two-way split here or at most a three-way split? And would playing that out allow me to fill up the board? And if so, then it's a great idea to go for. Eli, I'm not familiar with the term parallel universe. I would love it if you could elaborate a little bit, maybe in the chat, on like what you've heard about that. That certainly could be a way of thinking about this. So I'll keep an eye out and I'll respond to you in the chat. In the meantime, let's just do a quick recap of what we've seen so far. So we've seen two types of games. This is a game that relies on a number line. Now, number line games can get fancier. Sometimes you need a two-layer, like a double-decker number line. Sometimes you need an out column for your number line. But those types of games are all building from this basic number line. So the first step is let me recognize when I need a number line. The other type of game that we've seen is our tree game, where we don't have enough specific information to really make it worth our while to make a number line, but we do still have the ordering scenario. What we're going to do now is move into a couple of games that are no longer asking us to put things in order at all, but are asking us to put things into groups. And let's see what some ways are that we might organize this information. So here's the next game I'm going to have you work on. I'll give you 2.5 minutes again. All right, that's 2.5 minutes. So I know from the outset that I should not use a number line and I should not use a tree for this game. Why not? Tell me in the chat. Perfect, Sarah. It's a grouping game. So I am trying to pile elements up together into clusters or groups. It's not going to make sense to spread them out and put them one at a time. So the basic diagram that is used for many different grouping games is what we call a board. And this is actually kind of a fancy game. So I'm going to try to emphasize what are the essential elements of a board, and then we'll get into some of the like fancier stuff that's going on in this game in particular. So a board is something that we can often use when we've got a few different groups. Sometimes we'll know how many elements are going to go in each group, and sometimes we won't. So in this case, we've got 3 different groups, M, O, and S. And so the sort of basics of a board are I figure out what is the group and what are the things going in the groups. So in this case, the projects are the groups because I'm going to have multiple people assigned to each project. I put the thing that I would label as the group down at the bottom. So that's the bottom of my board. And then I make a certain number of slots going up, or some people prefer to do it going down, that's fine, based on what the scenario tells me. In this case, I'm told that these 4 students are assigned to 1 or more of the projects. This is important. Sometimes everybody just gets exactly one and nobody can be repeated. In this case, it's one or more. So there's the possibility that some of these people are going to do, all 3 projects. That means that the most that could happen, the most that could be put in any one of these groups is 4. So I'm going to start by making 4 slots on my board. And they also tell me a few specific pieces of information within the rules. So I'm going to hold off for a minute on this bit. Each project will have at least one assigned, because I want to stay focused on sort of the fundamental elements of a grouping board. So we get some exclusions. Barnes and Dia are not assigned to sleep. So I'm going to cross those off below like this. C is assigned to obesity, so I'll put C here. We have a conditional rule, which I'm just going to write off to the side. If B is assigned to obesity, then A is assigned to sleep. And then we start getting a little fancy. So before I get into this next rule, I just want to call out that this is sort of the basics of what a grouping board looks like. It's got a base, it's got slots going up, and you're trying to place the elements in those slots. Now, this particular board is a slightly fancier version of grouping called open grouping. And again, if you're just starting out with your LSAT studies, you might want to tune this part out for like a minute. It might feel a little overwhelming, and just focus on making sure you understand what we've already got here. But because this is a game where we don't actually know how many people are going to be in each group, we need to represent the possibilities of the numbers for each group in some way. Kind of what's the range? So we're told that each project will have at least 1 student. And I represent that with a box at the bottom. So when I put a box around a space, it means someone needs to go here. I don't care who it is, but we need to have someone. I also am told that sleep cannot have fewer students assigned to it than metabolism. So there's this comparison going on between sleep and metabolism, where metabolism basically has to be greater than or equal to, so I'm gonna make a little greater than or equal to symbol there, than sleep. So how many people can go and sleep? Well, I know B and D cannot, so really sleep kind of maxes out at 2. And if metabolism has to be greater than or equal to that, then metabolism has to have at least 2. So I'm going to add another box right here for metabolism. And once I've done that, then I'm going to cycle back through the rules and see if I made any mistakes or if I can make any new connections. So B and D are not assigned to sleep. I'm good there. C is assigned to obesity. If B is in obesity, A is in sleep. We don't know about that. Sleep cannot have fewer students assigned to it than metabolism. I did make a mistake. So that's why that second round is so important. I bet some of you are calling me out on it in the chat. So it's sleep cannot have less than metabolism. So sleep, we know, has a max of 2. And so that means that metabolism can't have more than 2. Cool. Again, this is why we do those second rounds, because there's so much going on in our heads when we are working through a logic game that mistakes like that are inevitable. So I encourage my students not to work on, how do I completely eliminate careless errors, but how do I catch them? What are the processes that I use to make sure I notice when they happen, because they will happen. And so that was a great example of how we read the rules more than once. Cool. And yeah, you all caught it too. Okay. So checking out the question or the chat, thank you all for catching that mistake with me. And Tuska, let me answer your question. The question that I ask myself when I start every game is this game asking me to put things in groups? Or is this game asking me to put things in order? And yes, I can go over the idea that the group is projects again. So basically, what I'm thinking about when I set up this board is how do I want to organize these? So what do I want to consider to be the group? And what are the things I'm putting in the group? Sometimes there's more than one possibility. So I technically could put A, B, C, and D at the bottom and then add M, O, and S according to, whether they get assigned to each of those people. But when I look at the rules, the language that's used in the rules is that these people are being assigned to these different projects. And I use that language of who's being assigned to what to help me decide what I want to put at the base here. So I want the elements to be the things that are being assigned to something, and I want the base to be the thing they're being assigned to, the groups that they're being put in, if that makes sense. All right, cool. Thanks, everybody. So this next game is going to feel a little weird if you are new to the LSAT. It is our final grouping game, and it's different from what we just did in a couple of ways. So if it feels overwhelming, if you've never seen anything like it before, I want you to focus on just what is different about it from this game that we just did, and why won't the board that we just used work for this final game. So let me pull it up for you. All right, here it is. Go ahead. All right, that is time. So Sarah, great question. So first, if this doesn't make sense to you, it's all good, but just to briefly answer your question, Sarah, yes, absolutely. You should be symbolizing contrapositives on the actual test, and we'll get more into that in a minute. Okay, so tell me in the chat, what was different about this game from the last one? Why not make a board here? Totally. It is what we call an in and out game. So before I show you the diagram, let's just highlight the differences between this and the last game. So in this game, we have a situation where there are only 2 options for each of these 6 individuals, and they're all going to only sign up for one or the other. Sarah referred to this as an in and out game, and that's because a lot of variations of this game will be more focused on, there's a team and people are either going to make the team or they're not. So they have they're either in or they're out. So very exclusive, binary, one of 2 options type of game. The other thing that makes this a special type of game is that all of the rules are what we think of as conditional rules. If this person does X, it triggers this other person to do Y. And so when we have an in and out game, there is a cool way to make connections between the rules that goes beyond what we're able to do if we set up a board. So it's not that setting up a board would necessarily be wrong. We do have 2 groups here. We have bingo and a cooking class. We could put, a certain number of spaces in each of them, but it's more just that it doesn't maximize the information that we can get from this game. So when we are facing an in and out game, when we have those 2 options and we've got conditional statements, I'll show you what the diagram might look like. And this might be a little overwhelming at first. I promise I'll walk you through it. So I'm going to cover some of this up. So over here is the starting point. This is what we call the logic chain. You can see that we have all of the letters of the cruise ship passengers written down. And then we've got a bunch of arrows connecting them together. And those arrows are meant to help us understand the relationship between what happens if one person's in a bingo class or the other person's in a cooking class. So just to give you an example of how to read this chart, if I look over here, I see L on the bingo side has an arrow pointing to O on the cooking side. What that means is if L is in a bingo class, then O is in the cooking class. And that's exactly what the first rule says. So I'll give you a little rundown of how we would build a chart like this. I would start with my 2 groups. So I've got bingo or cooking. And I would just start with the letters involved in the first rule. So I've got L and O. One kind of non-intuitive thing about this game is that when you write the letters down, you want to put it across from itself. So I put L in both columns. And that might seem weird at first, but basically it means I need to be able to consider what happens if L's in bingo or what happens if L's in cooking. And then I'm also going to put O in both again, so I can consider both possibilities. So then I have this relationship. If L is in bingo, then I can use an arrow to represent the then. O is in cooking. So L in bingo means O in cooking. And so I would just draw an arrow and it's going to go L on the bingo side to O on the cooking side. Sarah mentioned this idea called the contrapositive. The contrapositive is a concept of formal conditional logic where if you have an if-then statement, like if A, then B, sorry, I lost my color, and you reverse and negate that statement, if not B, then not A, that reversal and negation is called the contrapositive, and it is always true. And that is a complex kind of concept to wrap your brain around. If you dig a little bit into our materials, you'll find some great examples of how the contrapositive works using real world scenarios and why a contrapositive is what it is. It's a little bit outside of the scope of what we're trying to master today, so I'm not going to get too far into it. But if you take my word for it, you can reverse and negate this relationship. And in terms of this L and O rule, what that means is I would put O first and imagine that it is instead in bingo. If O is in bingo, then L must not have attended bingo. So L must have attended cooking. And I can draw that relationship onto my number or onto my logic chain as well. So O is in bingo, then L is in cooking. I'm going to check this rule off. And I'm going to go to the last rule because it's kind of the next simplest one. If K is in cooking, then P is in bingo. So this is similar to the rule that I just did. So I'm going to add K and P on each side. But I noticed that this rule starts with cooking. So I'm going to say if K is in cooking, then P is in bingo. The contrapositive of that would be if I reverse it and negate it, then P is in cooking, means K is in bingo. So I'm going to draw that out right here. Now let's get back to these other two rules. So we'll go to the P and S rule. I'm going to add an S here. And it says P and S attend different activities. So I'm going to take a minute to think that through. If P is in cooking, then that means that S is going to have to be in bingo. And if P is in bingo, then that means that S is going to have to be in cooking. If S is in cooking, that means that P is in bingo. And if S is in bingo, that means that P is in cooking. So when I actually draw this out on my number line, or sorry, I don't know why I keep calling it number line, on my logic chain, I go from P is in cooking to S is in bingo. P is in bingo to S is in cooking. S is in cooking to P is in bingo, and S is in bingo to P is in cooking. And you'll notice that basically what I end up with is this cross of arrows going in both directions. And this is what we call a biconditional. What it ultimately means is they can't be together. And another way to represent that, if you find this multiple arrow situation overwhelming, is to just use this dot notation, which is something that is taught in our books as a notation that's exclusively for the situation where we have a biconditional. You'll notice that that notation is used again for K and O attend the same activity. That's because that's also a biconditional. If O is in baking, then, or sorry, bingo, then K is in bingo, and vice versa. If O is in cooking, then K is in cooking, and vice versa. And this gets us the logic chain. We can totally go over the last double arrow. Yeah, so this one that we just did. So basically, the idea is that they're in different activities, right? So whenever P is going to be in the C column, S is going to be in the B column, or vice versa. So if I put P here, it triggers S to be over here, pushes it away. If I put P here, S goes here, gets pushed away. And the same thing happens with S. If S is here, it pushes P away. If S is here, it pushes P away. So that ends up with basically, you know, I could do like a double-headed arrow between P and S. I'll show you what that would look like. Oh, that's the wrong color. I'll put one of those on the sketch diagram over here. You know, it's going in both, that's not what I meant to do, both directions, like so. The reason that they don't use the double-headed arrow is because then you never have a starting point. So instead they use the dot to indicate the starting point. Great question, Eli. The logic chain is not the appropriate diagram for all grouping games. And I think this is a good point for us to kind of start wrapping up with. So the logic chain is appropriate for this particular game for two major reasons. So of the grouping games, the first reason this is appropriate to use the logic chain is there's exactly two groups. And the second reason is that all the rules are conditional. That puts me in a situation where I can make a two-column chart and I can use these arrows to connect the rules together. You'll notice that if we go back to the previous game, we did not use a logic chain, but this was still a grouping game. This was a grouping game that had three groups, and not all the rules were conditional. So anytime you've got a grouping game and the rules are not all conditional, you're generally going to want to think about making a board instead of a chain. Sarah, if you are in a game where there's only two options, right, like two groups, then blocks and anti-blocks can be seen as conditionals. If you know, if A is here, then B is also going to be here. But it's pretty specific to this type of game. So that's the fact that we're in a grouping game and the fact that it is an in and out game with only the two groups that makes it possible for us. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all so much for coming. Just a couple of closing thoughts before you head out. So again, the book that this all came from was the 5-pound book of LSAT Practice Drills, and those hand-drawn solutions that you were seeing are also in the book. So if you found this helpful, you might want to check it out. And you can also check out our upcoming courses on our website. And remember that you can try the first session of any of them for free. The books are not available for free. They're available for purchase. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.